They say kings die with glory, wrapped in banners and praised in song. But William, Conqueror of England, scourge of the North, Lord of Normandy, died groaning, naked, rotting, and bursting open in front of horrified mourners inside a church that once echoed his name with reverence. He was not slain by sword nor felled in battle. He was undone by his own belly, a gut so bloated with pride and weight that one fatal jolt on the saddle tore him apart from the inside. And yet that gruesome image was not the end of his story, but only the beginning of a slow, rotting, shame-soaked descent from glory to garbage. It began in the sweltering month of August, in the year 1087, when William, pushing 60, far past the warrior prime, was mocked by King Philip of France, who joked that the King of England was lying in bed like a woman after childbirth. That one insult, thrown like a careless match, lit a fire inside a man who had once crossed the channel and crushed an entire kingdom. He had butchered villages, silenced rebellions, torn England apart to sew it back together under his rule. But now, he was old, and fat, and insulted, and instead of laughing it off, William mounted up. He rode with vengeance in his eyes and smoke in his wake, burning the town of Montes, just west of Paris, as if to scream with flame, "I am still a conqueror." But fate is cruel, and horses have no mercy. While riding around the flaming ruins of Mantes, William tried to jump a ditch, something he'd done 1,000 times as a younger man, leaner and lighter, when his armor didn't strain at the seams. This time, as his horse landed, his stomach slammed violently against the pommel of his saddle, and something inside him tore. Maybe his intestines ruptured, maybe his bladder burst. Whatever it was, it sent a jolt of pain so sudden, so precise, so vicious, that William nearly fell from the saddle. A king who had seen war, who had ordered slaughter, who had watched limbs cut and heads roll, he had never known a pain like this. He knew, in that moment, with every trembling heartbeat and every drop of sweat, that he was dying. He was rushed to Rouen, to the priory of Saint Gervais, not to be healed, but to die in private for 4 long weeks. His moans filled the halls. Monks prayed, but even they knew it was hopeless. The wound, internal and untouchable, festered. His body began to rot before his heart stopped beating. But he was still king. And even in agony, William dictated his will. He gave England to his second son, William Rufus. He gave Normandy to his troublemaking eldest, Robert Curthose. He gave Henry, the youngest, only a pile of money. He released prisoners. He gave gold to churches. And in the quietest, most human moment of all, William wept for what he had done to the English, especially the horrific harrying of the North, when he had burned their homes and salted their fields. Now, as death loomed, the mighty conqueror feared for his soul. Then, on the 9th day of September, in the year 1087, William the Conqueror died. But his story was not over. No sooner had his chest gone still than the looting began. Servants and attendants who had once bowed and scraped now fell on his corpse like rats to a feast. They tore the rings from his fingers, the fine cloth from his body, even the shoes from his feet. They stole the furniture, the silver, the swords from his room. His knights and lords abandoned the body and fled to their own lands, eager to secure power in the vacuum. And so, the king who had conquered England was left naked on the cold stone floor alone, forgotten, and stripped of all dignity. No one knew what to do with the body. There were no plans. No clear successor to handle the funeral. Days passed. The corpse began to swell. The smell became unbearable. Finally, someone decided to bury William at Saint Etienne in Seine, a monastery he had founded decades earlier. But it was too late. The body had gone bad. As the funeral procession marched, disaster followed. First, there was a fire that stalled the journey. Then a knight objected to William being buried on land he claimed was his. But the worst was still to come. When the swollen corpse was brought to the church, it no longer fit the coffin. Monks tried to cram it in, pushing hard on the lid, sweating and muttering prayers. But the body pushed back. And then, it happened, a sickening thud. Avec Pope. A sound no one ever forgets. The king's bloated belly burst. Rotting flesh and putrid fluids spilled out. The smell made people gag, cover their faces, flee. The funeral was ruined. The sermons were skipped. The prayers were cut short. No one could bear to stay. At last, they buried what was left of William. Not with honor, not with glory, but with horror and haste. The coffin was lowered not into legend, but into a pit of embarrassment. And so ended the life of William the Conqueror, not with a crown on his head, but with his guts soaking through his own burial robes. A once great king remembered not for his victories, but for the way his body betrayed him in death. There is something unspoken that travels through the air on a battlefield long after the last torch is lit and the last order is given. Something that hums beneath the weight of armor and the breath of horses. Something that hangs on the fringe of every act of violence. The possibility that death, silent and patient, is watching from the edge of vision. On that hot August afternoon in the year 1087, as the town of Mantes burned behind him, and smoke curled upward like the last sigh of a village undone, William of Normandy, King of England, Duke of Normandy, the man once called Bastard and now called Conqueror, rode alone at the head of his retinue, his armored chest heaving beneath layers of sweat-soaked linen and steel, his belly bloated with the years of feast and power, and his eyes still burning with insult. What echoed in his mind was not the cries of peasants nor the roar of fire, but the mocking voice of King Philip of France, who had sneered that William lay in bed like a woman after childbirth. That was the wound that had cut deepest, and it was the one that would never heal. The campaign had not been a strategic necessity. It was a tantrum disguised as conquest. A lashing out of pride from a man who had spent decades demanding respect and obedience, and who could not bear to be laughed at by a fellow monarch. The destruction of Mantes was swift and merciless, a message written in flame. But William wanted more than destruction. He wanted proof. Living proof. That he was still the man he had once been. The warrior duke who had crossed the channel and taken a crown with sword in hand. So when the path led across a shallow ditch on the outskirts of the smoldering town, he did not hesitate. He tightened the reins, leaned forward slightly in the saddle, and spurred the horse to leap just as he had done so many times before. In youth, in vigor, in confidence, the horse obeyed, hooves lifting, muscles bunching beneath gleaming flanks. And for a brief moment, man and beast hung in the air like a painting. But the moment they landed, everything changed. The impact sent a jolt through the saddle, a sudden and vicious lurch that drove the solid iron pommel deep into William's belly. He did not cry out at first. The breath was ripped from his lungs. His eyes widened. His back arched. And something inside him gave way, a sharp, wet tearing that no one else could hear, but that he felt with the unmistakable clarity of doom. Whether it was a rupture of his intestines or the bursting of his bladder, no one could say. But the pain was immediate, searing, and total. It was not the pain of a cut or a bruise or even a broken bone. It was a pain that told the truth. A pain that whispered in his blood, "This is the beginning of the end." His grip faltered. The reins slipped through his fingers. Perhaps he swayed in the saddle. Perhaps his knight saw his face go pale. Perhaps the horse stumbled as it sensed the faltering weight of its rider. But William, though drowning in agony, did not fall. He held himself upright, by force of will if nothing else, and did not speak of the pain. There was no announcement, no royal decree, just sweat beading on his forehead, breath shallow in his lungs, and the knowledge that something had gone terribly wrong. The ride back to camp was slow. His attendants said nothing. But they knew. The campaign ended that day. Not because the mission was complete, but because the king's body had declared its surrender in the quietest and cruelest of ways. The wound was hidden, internal, invisible to the eye, but burning like fire in his core. He could not ride far. He could not eat. He could not rest. There were no healers who could reach inside him and stitch what had been torn. All they could offer were prayers, cold cloths, and the silence of despair. They carried him to Rouen, to the priory of Saint-Gervais, where the halls were cold and the walls hummed with the memory of monks long dead. There, in a narrow bed beneath heavy beams, William lay down not to recover, but to prepare. The air was thick with incense. Candles burned at all hours. And outside his window, the wind whispered through the leaves, as if even the trees knew he would not rise again. The days passed slowly. The pain did not fade. It settled in his gut like a coiled snake, growing more venomous with each passing hour. He could no longer stand. He could barely speak. His skin turned waxen. His breath came in short, shallow pulls. At times, he drifted into fevered sleep, mumbling to ghosts no one else could see. At other times, he stared at the ceiling, lips moving in silent confession. He knew what was coming. And so, with what strength remained, he began to put his house in order. He summoned scribes and priests. He whispered instructions. He divided his lands like a merchant, dividing spoiled goods: England to William Rufus, Normandy to Robert Curthose, and gold, only gold, to young Henry. He set prisoners free. He ordered coins distributed to churches and to the poor. He asked for forgiveness, though perhaps not loudly enough, for all his victories, for all the blood he had spilled and the crowns he had claimed. In the end, William of Normandy lay dying like any other man alone, afraid and riddled with regret. And outside, the world waited for the bells to toll, for the king to die, and for the crown to pass into other hands. In the high, vaulted chambers of the priory of Saint-Gervais, where time seemed to move with the breath of the wind and the echo of every footstep lingered longer than it should. The silence was broken, not by chance nor by prayer, but by the long, aching moans of a man dying in pieces. For 4 weeks, William the Conqueror, once the most feared name on either side of the Channel, lay stretched upon a low, hard bed, his face a waxen mask, his brow wet with fever, his breath shallow, his eyes darting between the flickering candlelight and the black corners of the room where only the dying see movement. The monks of the priory walked with quiet feet and solemn faces, and though their mouths murmured prayers and their fingers clutched beads, They could not help but wince at the cries that spilled from behind the heavy wooden door. Each cry was a thread unraveling the image of the man they had known only from coin and chronicle. A king now reduced to a broken body that trembled beneath its sheets, and a soul that seemed already half untethered from its cage of flesh. It was not just the pain of the injury, though, the agony of his ruptured insides, rotting slowly from within. It must have felt like hell chewing its way upward. It was the pain of memory that tormented William in those final days. At times, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the shadows stretched long and the candles burned low, he would whisper things that no priest could understand and no monk dared write down. Names of towns, long buried, faces of men he had ordered killed, the sound of fire crackling through villages, the sobs of the women of York. He spoke of the north, of the blood-soaked fields, of children left without fathers, of towns starved by design. They had called it the harrying. But to William, in these final moments, it was something deeper, darker, something that returned to him in dreams, and now, in death. Sometimes he spoke to the ceiling, other times to the empty chair beside his bed. And more than once, he turned to the darkness at the foot of his bed and said, "Wait, just a little longer." The monks did what they could. They prayed. They bathed his skin with cool water. They lit candles. They changed his linens as best they could. But none of that stopped the decay. The smell began after the first week, faint at first, like damp wood or old blood, but soon growing stronger, heavier, until it filled the room and seeped into the stones. The king, even before he died, was rotting. His belly swelled. His skin turned gray. The fever boiled behind his eyes. But still he lived. And still he moaned. And still he whispered to the ghosts that only he could see. One monk claimed to have heard him call for his mother. Another swore he cried out for Matilda, his queen, dead now more than a decade, but none of them spoke of it aloud. It is a terrible thing to hear a king cry for forgiveness when he has spent his life denying it to others. On the third week, William summoned a scribe and dictated his will with a clarity that startled the brothers. His voice was thin, yes, and labored, but the words were sharp, as if some inner flame had flared up once more. And he became for a moment the man he had once been, the general, the tyrant, the king. He named his heirs. He confirmed his lands. He distributed his wealth with the cold precision of a man arranging coins on a battlefield map. He left England, the crown he had taken by blood and cunning, to his second son, William, called Rufus, red-haired, strong-willed, and ambitious. He left Normandy to his eldest, Robert, rebellious, frustrating, yet beloved in some half-ashamed way, and to Henry, the quiet son, the scholar, the watcher in the corners of court. He gave gold a fortune, perhaps, but not a throne. It was a division that would not hold. But in that room, as ink met, parchment and breath came short and rattled. It was law. After the scribe was dismissed, William grew keener. The pain did not lessen, but it became familiar. The moaning slowed. The whispers grew softer. Sometimes he slept with his mouth open and his eyes fluttering, and the monks wondered if the soul was already drifting, inch by inch, toward the veil. Other times, he stared at the ceiling for hours, unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. One monk claimed that on the night of the fourth Sunday, William suddenly sat up and cried out in perfect Norman, There is fire behind me before collapsing back onto the bed, unconscious for a full day. And then, on the final night, the winds grew still. The candles in the hall did not flicker. The moaning ceased. William lay with one hand atop his chest and one hand open at his side, as if he had finally let go. The monks gathered at the door but did not enter. They waited. When the dawn came and the light filtered through the old glass, a priest stepped into the room and found the king's mouth slightly open, his eyes staring upward, and the room suddenly, chillingly quiet. It was the 9th day of September, in the year 1087, William the Conqueror, scourge of the Saxons, breaker of oaths, builder of castles and breaker of bones, had died, not with a sword in his hand, not in battle, not on a throne, but in a narrow bed that smelled of death, surrounded not by warriors or banners, but by silent monks who would remember only the sound of his moaning and the strange names he whispered into the dark. When kings die, there is meant to be a silence, then a mourning, then a rising up of order to replace the man who has fallen. But when William the Conqueror breathed his last on that gray September morning in the year 1087, no crown was lifted, no trumpet sounded, and no successor stepped forward to cradle the weight of a kingdom. Instead, there was a pause, a hollow, dangerous pause, and then there was movement. Not of princes or lords fulfilling duty, but of men with greedy fingers and frightened hearts, who saw not a dead king but a vulnerable corpse, who saw not legacy but loot. In that space between life and burial, where dignity should have stood guard, only chaos came. The first to act were not nobles, not bishops, not heirs, but servants, those who had spent years tending the king's food, warming his bed, holding his stirrups. Those who had bowed deepest were the first to break the silence. They slipped into his death chamber, not with prayers, but with purpose. They did not weep. They did not kneel. They reached. They pulled. They tore. One removed the gold ring from William's swollen finger, twisting the knuckle until the flesh gave way. Another stripped the fine linens from his limbs. A third took the jeweled belt from his waist. His boots were yanked from his feet. His chamber was gutted silver. Goblets, daggers, even the very mattress on which he had died. In minutes, the body of the conqueror lay exposed, not just in death, but in degradation, robbed of everything but a thin layer of soiled underclothes. Outside the chamber, word spread. Knights who had ridden beside him on the fields of Hastings, lords who had pledged fealty at court, clerics who had once sung his praises in choirs, they too fled, not toward the body, but away from it. They returned to their own lands, to their own castles, to their own ambitions. For each man knew what came next. A crown unclaimed is a blade waiting to fall. And with William gone, the careful balance of power that had been forced into place by his iron will now teetered on the edge of civil storm. His sons would quarrel. His nobles would posture. His enemies would whisper. But no one, in those hours, stayed to stand, watch over the body of the man who had forged a nation through fire. And so, the room grew quiet again, but not the solemn quiet of grief. It was the empty quiet of a place abandoned, a hollow stillness made worse by what remained behind. The king lay on the floor where they had left him. No guards, no candles, no psalms, just the stench of rot beginning to rise and the grim outline of a life unguarded in its ending. A monk later wrote that he had passed the room and dared not enter. that something in the air made his throat close and his stomach turn. It was not merely the smell of death. It was the smell of disgrace. Days passed before anyone returned to the body. And even then, not out of loyalty, but obligation. The bishops convened not to honor the king, but to decide what to do with the remains. It was decided that he would be buried at the Abbey of Saint Etienne in Caen, a place he had founded decades earlier in a moment of piety or perhaps politics. A monument to his reign made of stone and silent prayer. But nothing about the coming funeral would go as planned. The delay had allowed time for decay, and the swelling of his corpse was now impossible to ignore. His belly had grown taut and distended. His skin had taken on the color of wet parchment. The body, once so feared in life, was now feared in death, for reasons no one wanted to admit aloud. When they tried to dress him, they found that the finest robes no longer fit. The cloth would not stretch across his bloated chest. The golden rings they tried to replace slid off fingers now twisted and unrecognizable. When they lifted him into the coffin, the wooden frame groaned beneath the weight and shape of a man unfit for rest. Even the coffin seemed to reject him. As the procession began its slow, halting journey to Caen, the omens multiplied. A fire broke out along the road, delaying their march. At the gates of the abbey, a knight interrupted the ceremony, claiming the land upon which William was to be buried had been unjustly seized by the king years earlier. The funeral halted while gold was paid to silence the claim. The monks whispered among themselves. The nobles looked away. The smell was now unbearable. The king had waited too long for burial, and yet the worst had not yet come. When at last they reached the high altar and attempted to lower the corpse into the grave, they realized the coffin would not close. William's body, too swollen, refused to yield. The monks pressed. They leaned. They pushed with arms trembling and foreheads wet with sweat. And then, with a sickening crack, something ruptured. The belly of the king burst open. A spray of foul liquid and decay filled the air, a stench so vile it seemed to crawl into the lungs of every man present. The abbey echoed not with prayers but with gags. Monks turned their faces. Nobles stumbled backward. The sermon was cut short. The liturgy abandoned. In that sacred place where kings were meant to be laid to rest with glory, William was hurriedly shoved into the ground as quickly as the soil would cover him. The coffin was closed. Not with reverence, but with force. The man who had conquered England, the man who had ruled with an iron hand and a swollen pride, was remembered not for his victories, but for the day his own body rejected the earth's embrace. It should have been over. The king was dead. The prayers were said, the coffin carved, and the tomb prepared. But nothing about the death of William the Conqueror unfolded as it should have. It was not glorious. It was not peaceful. And it was not dignified. By the time his bloated corpse arrived at the Abbey of Saint Etienne in the city of Caen, his chosen place of burial, the house of God he had funded and raised with coin drawn from conquest, the line between reverence and horror had already been crossed. The man who once commanded empires now repulsed the very air around him, and though the church stood tall and noble in stone, filled with golden light from windows above and thick with incense to hide what could no longer be hidden, it could not contain the smell of a king gone wrong. The monks who served the funeral had never prepared for a body like this. The journey from Rouen to Caen had taken too long. The corpse had been kept too poorly. The swelling had become grotesque. His once firm body, once praised in battle, once mounted on horseback and clad in mail, had become an unrecognizable mound, sagging, bulging, breaking at its seams. The death room had already been stripped of valuables. The crown had already passed into question. But what faced them now was not merely a dead man. It was a problem no ritual could solve. No chant could cover. No hymn could cleanse. As the church bells rang and the congregation gathered, the monks tried, with pale faces and trembling hands, to dress him one final time. The robe, woven for kings, would not drape over his chest. The crown would not rest properly on his head. When they lifted the body toward the coffin crafted of wood, finely worked, dark and polished, they discovered that the dimensions no longer matched William's girth. Exaggerated by decay, made the fit impossible. Still, the monks did not call it off. They did not stop. Too much had been invested in the illusion of reverence. The service had begun. The guests were present, and the abbey, echoing with Latin hymns and the footsteps of nobles, could not allow for failure, not in the eyes of heaven, nor in the memory of history. So they pushed. It began with effort disguised as formality. A gentle press on the lid, then firmer, then more hands joined, then weight shifted forward. One monk braced his knees, another leaned his shoulder, and slowly, as the wood creaked and the corpse refused to bend, desperation began to settle in. There were no prayers now, no music, only the soft, sickening groan of a body being forced where it no longer wished to go. And then it happened. A pop, wet and dull, broke the silence. The king's abdomen ruptured. What spilled forth was not metaphor but matter, fluids putrid with infection, gases long trapped now released, and a stench so vile, it did not simply fill the church. It consumed it. It moved through the nave like a wave, wrapped around pillars, crawled beneath pews, and forced itself into every nostril, every mouth, every lung. There was no stopping it, no hiding from it. It was the smell of a king whose body had turned against him, whose legacy had curdled before it could be sealed. Gasps echoed from the benches. One bishop clutched his chest. A noble gagged and stumbled out into the courtyard. Monks crossed themselves and turned their faces. The sermon, planned to recount William's great deeds, was shortened to a whisper. The eulogy, meant to exalt his glory, was skipped entirely. No one remained who could look upon his remains and speak of greatness. The only thing now being conquered was the air. Still, the monks persisted. Perhaps it was duty. Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps it was the only way to salvage what was left of a moment already lost. They lowered the body into the grave as quickly as reverence allowed, or perhaps faster. They shoveled soil over flesh and cloth, not because it was sacred, but because they could no longer bear to see it. The coffin lid, smeared now with what should never have been released, was pressed shut at last. Not gently, not with a kiss of peace, but with the finality of necessity. The grave was sealed. The doors of the abbey were opened, and the mourners poured out not in solemn grief, but in desperate relief. Outside, the air was clean again. The sunlight fell golden on the flagstones. The wind rustled the trees in the monastery garden as though nothing had happened at all. But inside, beneath the altar, beneath the marble, beneath the stone that would one day be inscribed with titles and honorifics, lay a man whose body had screamed louder than any victory, and whose funeral had become an unholy lesson in the decay of power. William the Conqueror had taken England with steel and fury. He had ruled with an iron will, crushed rebellion, carved his mark into law, land, and blood. But in death, he was remembered not for the lives he ruled, but for the body that no coffin could contain, and the breathless terror that filled the house of God when his remains betrayed him in front of the very people who once bowed to his throne. If there had been any dignity left to salvage, if time had wrapped its veil around the disaster that was William's funeral and allowed the earth to forget, it might have ended there with the coffin finally closed, the grave finally filled, and the stench of a ruined body slowly fading into the stone. But history is never kind to the unloved dead. And even in death, William the Conqueror found no peace. The tomb that had taken days to prepare and only moments to defile would, for centuries to come, remain as restless as the man himself had once been in life. His bones would not stay buried. His legacy would not remain still. The grave itself would become a wound, reopened again and again by curiosity, greed, war, and time. They sealed the tomb in silence after the collapse of the funeral. A silence, not of reverence but of shame. The marble slab laid atop his grave in the Abbey of Saint Etienne bore a Latin inscription, carved in measured words, calling him invincible, conqueror, duke, king, founder. But no inscription could speak over the memory of that bursting coffin. And those who had attended the funeral remembered not the titles, but the smell. The abbey stood quiet for a time. The prayers were resumed. The monks went back to their rhythms of bell and candle, and the grave, at least on the surface, was left undisturbed. But peace is a fragile thing, and tombs are rarely safe from the hands of men. In the year 1522, more than 4 centuries after William had been lowered into the ground, a curious cardinal driven by questions, by rumors, perhaps by superstition, ordered the tomb opened. No war had prompted it. No crisis. No scandal. Only the slow-burning urge that compels some men to see what ought not be seen. The abbey's brothers obeyed, perhaps reluctantly, perhaps nervously, as they removed the stones layer by layer until at last the coffin appeared once more. What remained of William was examined, though little was recorded. The bones were viewed, perhaps measured, perhaps touched. Then the grave was resealed, and for a time, it seemed that William could rest again. But rest would never last long for a king remembered more for fear than for love. In the year 1562, Var came. The wars of religion had torn France apart. And Caen, like many cities, was caught in the crossfire of faith turned to fury. It was then that a Calvinist mob, wild, with rage and certainty, descended upon the abbey. They smashed windows, burned relics, desecrated altars, and they came for the tomb. They had heard, perhaps, that treasure was buried with the conqueror, or perhaps they simply wanted to shatter the bones of kings who had ruled in the name of a faith they no longer respected. They tore open the grave, not with care, but with violence. They found no gold. They found no weapons. Only bones white, silent, fragile with age. And those bones, once wrapped in silk and prayers, were cast aside, scattered, trampled, lost. Some fragments were recovered. A thigh bone, it is said, was found and kept. The rest, who could say, dust in the floor of the abbey, chips of bone in the shoes of looters, perhaps some relic kept in secret by a horrified monk, or thrown into the wind by a furious hand. But the man himself, the conqueror, had been reduced to parts, not by time, but by men. They tried, decades later, to gather what was left. In the year 1642, A new monument was placed. What bones remained were reinterred with ceremony and sorrow. A slab of white marble was laid over the grave. The Latin words were carved again. "Here lies the invincible William," it said. And yet even stone could not rewrite what had happened to the man below. He no longer rested in the body that had once worn a crown. He no longer lay whole in the grave he had chosen. He was, even now, scattered across memory and stone. And then came revolution. In the final years of the 18th century, when the fury of the people burned hotter than any funeral fire, the French Revolution swept through abbeys and cathedrals with the hunger of cleansing flame. No tomb was safe. No king was spared. In those turbulent days, when the heads of monarchs fell beneath the blade and the symbols of tyranny were torn down stone by stone, William's tomb was opened once more. This time, it was not curiosity that drove the hands of men, but hatred. The tomb was broken. The bones, what little still remained, were cast out. And again, William was flung into the world, not as a king, not even as a corpse, but as an afterthought. Some say his bones were thrown into the nearby river. Others say they were burned. Some claim one bone, a femur, was preserved, saved by one man in a moment of compassion or guilt. But no one can say for certain. The conqueror had been unmade. Today, in the Abbey of Saint Etienne, beneath the high altar where candles still burn and tourists still walk, there is a marble slab. Simple, unassuming. It bears his name and the barest details of his greatness. But beneath it lies not a king in repose. Not a whole man. Not even a full skeleton. Beneath it lies a fragment perhaps of the body that once crossed a sea and claimed a crown. A piece of bone. Alone in the dark. Beneath stone that remembers more than it dares to say. And so it is that William, who rose from a bastard son of Normandy to the crowned ruler of England, who defied odds and burned villages and reshaped history. I was never allowed the one thing most men take for granted: rest. His body was torn by accident. His funeral defiled by stench. His grave shattered by time and faith and rage. And even now, his bones lie in pieces, scattered by centuries, whispered through stone, never truly buried, never truly home. There are tombs in Europe where the silence feels earned, where the air hangs heavy with reverence, and visitors instinctively lower their voices, as if the stones themselves are listening. But at the Abbey of Saint Etienne, under the cold white marble slab that claims to mark the resting place of William the Conqueror, there is no such hush. Tourists pass over it with camera straps around their necks and maps in their hands. Children run past it, without knowing whose name lies carved in Latin beneath their feet. Even the pilgrims, those who do kneel, do not always kneel for him. They kneel for the altar, or for the relics of saints, or for their own quiet griefs, and not for the man whose legacy built the abbey's walls and whose death defiled its floor. Because though the slab is there, clean and dignified, etched with letters that name him invincible, Duke, King, and Founder, the silence around it is not reverent. It is awkward. It is thin. It is the silence of something that ought to be remembered but cannot be loved. For the monument itself is a fiction, and everyone who reads it knows it. It says, "Here lies William the Conqueror." But William does not lie there. Not really. What remains in that crypt beneath the marble is uncertain. Perhaps a single thigh bone retrieved after the desecration. Perhaps fragments of what once was a man, swept back into the dark by trembling hands, trying to salvage a shadow of the past. But he does not lie there as a whole king, as a man intact, as a figure to be buried and mourned in one piece. The rest of him has been scattered by mobs, by fire, by time itself. His tomb has been broken more than once. His remains have been stolen, spilled, lost, and left behind. The monument stands, but the man it honors is gone, and those who pass by seem to feel it, even if they cannot name it. There is no story etched in the marble to explain the stench that once filled the abbey at his funeral. No plaque tells of the monks pressing down on a bloated corpse until it exploded in front of nobles and bishops and weeping servants. There is no mention of the servants who stripped his body bare, of the chamber he died in being ransacked like a conquered village, or of the furious Protestant hands that shattered his coffin and hurled his bones into the unknown. The monument is clean, too clean. A name, a title, a pair of dates carved into silence. The man who conquered England is now reduced to a sentence in stone that leaves out everything that made his death unforgettable. There are moments when a visitor lingers, eyes trailing over the Latin letters, wondering if this was the same man from the tapestry, the same man from the battle, the same man whose sword brought down a kingdom. They may try to imagine him standing tall in armor, shouting commands across the fields of Hastings, banners flapping, oove pounding. But what the stone does not tell them, and what history does not always like to repeat, is that William did not die on a battlefield. It did not die surrounded by loyal guards or mourning nobles. He died in a bed that smelled of sweat and decay, moaning in the dark, repenting to ghosts. He died of a wound, not inflicted by war but by weight, not opened by blade, but by saddle. And when he died, he was robbed, left naked, and abandoned by the very men who had once called him master. The abbey itself has tried, over the years, to forget. The chapel has been rebuilt, the tomb resealed, the narrative smoothed over like a wax seal, pressed on parchment to cover a messy script beneath. But stone remembers, the cracks in the columns remember, the dark stains in the flagstone remember. The altar, silent above the slab, remembers the day the abbey's air turned sour, and the mass was interrupted by the sound of bursting flesh. And those who have read the letters, the chronicles, the reports whispered by scandalized monks cannot help but glance once more at the slab before walking on, thinking not of glory, but of how a man so feared in life was so abandoned in death. Still, people come, not in pilgrimage, not in veneration, but out of curiosity, out of duty, out of the long echo of his name in textbooks and timelines. They walk through the abbey, and they read the inscription and they move on. They do not bring flowers. They do not shed tears. They do not speak in hushed tones. They do not feel the pull of reverence that other kings inspire. Because this monument does not tell a full story. It tells the half that power writes the half about crowns and victories and lineages. It does not tell the half that death writes the half about rupture and rot and regret. And maybe that is fitting. Maybe for William. There was never going to be a tomb that could carry the weight of who he was and how he died. Maybe no coffin. No church. No inscription could hold together the contradiction of a man who built his rule by fear, but lost his final dignity to the very silence he once imposed on others. And maybe the reason the pilgrims do not kneel is because they do not need to. William has already been brought lower than any man should ever fall. And his bones, wherever they are, I have no need for prayer. He was a king who ruled with iron, not affection. And if the people knelt before him, it was not from love, but from fear. Even in life, William the Conqueror was never beloved, not by his subjects, not by his sons, not even by the scribes who chronicled his reign. They respected him. Perhaps. They feared him. Certainly. They obeyed him because they had no choice. But in the deep hours of night, when fires burned low and whispers passed between servants, his name was not lifted in reverent awe. It was spoken with bitterness, with caution, with loathing that had no safe outlet but silence. He was the king who had brought down England with a sword in one hand and a burning torch in the other, who had slaughtered the north into submission, who had salted the earth and starved whole counties to make a point. And so when he died, the people did not weep. They did not line the roads in mourning. They did not light candles at their doors or sing prayers at twilight. They did not feel they had lost a father. They felt, in the quiet of their homes, that a storm had finally passed. Yet history, unlike people, does not forget so easily. History watches. History listens. History collects every word, every order, every moan, and stores them in corners too deep for time to erase. And so it was that William, though unloved, was never truly left behind. His story continued not because he was cherished, but because he had changed the course of the world with such force that the earth itself seemed to tilt in his wake. The Norman conquest of England in the year 1066 was not a single battle, not even a single war. It was a transformation that bled through centuries, shaping languages, laws, cities, and crowns. What William built was not beautiful, but it was lasting, and what he left behind could not be ignored. The scribes wrote of him because they had to. They recorded the Domesday Book, that cold ledger of lives and lands, of sheep and mills and servants and borders, all noted in ink, so permanent it might as well have been carved in stone. They preserved his commands, his taxes, his punishments, his charters, not because they loved him, but because their world had been rearranged by him like a chessboard turned upside down. He had shattered the old order. The English nobility had been swept aside. The Norman lords filled their places. New castles rose where old homes had stood. And the people, though they had not chosen him, had to speak his language, follow his law, answer to his knights. William had made himself unavoidable. But being remembered is not the same as being mourned. In Normandy, they remembered him with pride, or so they claimed. Though even there, his children squabbled and rebelled, and his legacy cracked before his body had even turned cold. His eldest son, Robert Curthose, had always been a thorn in his side, a boy too proud, too ambitious, too resentful of a father who gave orders, but never approval. William had left him Normandy, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps because he did not trust him with England. His second son, William Rufus, inherited the English crown, but not the loyalty of the people. And Henry, the youngest, the one who had received nothing but coin, would later seize everything. The family William built tore itself apart almost immediately after his death, as if the glue that had held them together had never been love, only fear. And with that fear gone, there was nothing left to keep them from devouring each other. Even the church did not fully embrace him. Though he had built monasteries and given gold to abbeys, though he had spoken of penance in his final hours and named saints with trembling lips, the clergy never forgot the violence. They never forgot the harrying of the north. When he ordered villages razed, fields burned, cattle slaughtered, and the survivors left to starve in frozen mud so that the land would learn obedience, it was not discipline. It was devastation. And even the priests who accepted his gold could not clean that stain from his soul. In his final weeks, they gathered to offer last rites. But they did not declare him a saint. They did not lift his name as one worthy of heavenly reward. They prayed for his soul. Yes, but with a kind of urgency, as if they feared he might be the very man their scriptures warned against. What, then, does history do with a man like William? It cannot forget him. It cannot venerate him. It cannot bury him. For the earth refused to hold his body, and time refused to protect his bones. And so instead, history watches him. It circles him like a wary dog, and never sure whether to growl or to bow, it tells his story in halves, one half carved in stone, all conquest and coronation, the other half whispered in the dark of a body that burst in a church, of a grave broken by mobs, of a man whose own sons could not even agree on who he had truly been. There are no songs for William, no romantic poems, no glowing portraits painted by hopeful hands. There is only the weight of what he did, and the echoes of how he died. And in the end, perhaps that is the truest legacy. Some kings are loved and fade. Some are forgotten and forgiven. But William was a man who carved his name into the bones of a nation. Not with kindness, but with cruelty. He changed the shape of England, not with wisdom, but with fire. And for that, he would be remembered, not with flowers on his grave, but with entire histories built in his shadow. He would be studied, not celebrated. His castles would crumble. His tomb would be shattered. His bones scattered. But his name would remain, etched not in hearts, but in stone, in records, in the scars left behind by everything he touched. So when children walk through the abbey now and pass the slab with his name, when they glance down and ask their teachers who he was, the answer is never simple. He was a king. Yes, a conqueror, a ruler. But he was also a warning, a man whose power outlived his grace, a man who died as unloved as he had ruled. And when they move on, when their shoes step lightly over the stone that covers what little remains of him, they may not know the full story, but they have walked across it. And in that quiet passing, without reverence, without fear, without even noticing, they leave behind the one thing William never earned in life and never received in death: indifference. If you close your eyes, just for a moment, and breathe in the stillness that lives behind silence, not the kind that comes after words, but the kind that was there before them, if you breathe that in, and listen to the hush of time, pulling away from all the noise of life and war and rule, you might hear it. Not a trumpet, not a cheer, not even the final sigh of a dying man. You might hear the soft, impossible sound of a crown falling to the ground. Not because it was taken, not because it was dropped, but because there was no one left to carry it. That, more than the death or the funeral or the shattering of a tomb, was the truest end of William the Conqueror. A fall so quiet that no one noticed it until history turned its head and asked, where did he go? William did not go gently. He did not go surrounded by loved ones, or carried on the breath of legend. He went inch by inch, wound by wound, through 4 long weeks of rotting pain and groaning regret, in a bed that grew colder each day, in a chamber that became more empty as the hours passed. And when the final breath left his body on the 9th day of September, in the year 1087, it did not carry his soul upward like some sainted prince. It hovered, unsure, as if even death paused to ask whether the man before it had truly finished what he came to do. Because William, despite all he had conquered, had left something unfinished, something more fragile than kingdoms and more powerful than swords. He had failed to win love. And though history does not always require love to make a name eternal, it is love that smooths the edges, that lifts the face of the dead into something noble, something warm. Without it, even the most powerful men are left to decay, not just in flesh, but in memory. That is why no one mourned William when he died, why no son stood by his bed, why no queen wept over his body, why no bard strung his name into song, why the coffin did not fit, and the tomb did not hold, and the earth refused to keep him. A man unloved becomes unburied, even if his bones are sealed beneath 1,000 slabs of stone. But this is not just a tale of what was lost. It is also, in the strange and quiet way that stories settle when told late at night, a tale of what remains. William did something that very few men ever do. He altered the course of a people, not briefly, not for a reign or a war, but for 1,000 years. He stitched new lines into maps. He rewrote laws with his will. He changed the names on the stones of English graves and turned the language of the island into something never before spoken. He was a bastard from Normandy, laughed at by his enemies, doubted by his own court, mistrusted by his sons, and still, he crossed the Channel, stood tall at Hastings, and took a crown from a dead man's head. He ruled not by charm, not by wisdom, but by force, and for that, his mark is still here. But even kings with legacies that echo through centuries must one day lie down. And in the end, the crown falls. Not with applause, not with a clash, but with that sound. No one hears the sound of being forgotten in the ways that matter most. He was not forgotten by textbooks, of course, not by the historians who drew charts of his lineage or studied the weight of his tax records, not by the architects who still point to his castles, not by the teachers who whisper his name each October when they teach the children about the Battle of Hastings. But those are names preserved by duty, not by longing. William the Conqueror is remembered because he was inevitable, not because he was loved. And in that, he becomes something deeper than just a king. It becomes a question. What does it mean to win the world but lose the room you die in? What is power if no one stays to hold your hand? What is a crown if the coffin will not close? These are the questions that echo beneath the marble slab at the Abbey of Saint-Étienne. They are not carved into the stone. They are not spoken aloud. But they wait there, humming under the silence, for any soul brave enough to press an ear against the past and listen. Because stories like William's are not told to lift us up. They are told to weigh us down in the best way to anchor us in the truth that kings and commoners share the same fate. That no amount of iron or gold or land can guard against the body's betrayal. That the rot begins in silence. And that death, when it comes, asks not for titles, but for what you left behind in the hearts of men. And if there is nothing there, no warmth, no sorrow, no reverence, then all you leave is bone and trouble. And still the stone remains. It rests quietly in the abbey, unmoved, surrounded by travelers and prayers and the quiet tread of modern feet. It says only this: here lies the invincible William, the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, King of England, founder of this house, who died in the year 1087. But now you know what the stone will not say. Now you know the crown that fell, the fire that bloated, the monks who leaned and pushed until the king exploded, the sons who fought over what he had not given, the mobs who smashed his tomb, the thigh bone carried like a relic by men who didn't even believe in miracles anymore, the monument that lied, the silence that followed, and the people who never cried for him. And so, As your eyes grow heavy and the world softens at the edges, let this be your last thought before sleep, that even the most powerful man in the world, even the one who changed history with sword and fire, could not command his own farewell, that his final victory was not in the land he ruled, but in the way he reminds us now, gently, terribly, that every crown must fall, and when it does, it rarely makes a sound. Good night, William. Good night, Conqueror. History has not forgotten you, but it has not forgiven you either.